I will also talk about CSR, but I'm going to look at it from a little bit of a different perspective. And my interest is really, this is what I want to look for later research. So this is just a product to help me begin with first learning about the area, understanding it, and being able to come up with something in the future. So the objective of this particular paper is really first to understand the overall concept of CSR and its place in business in order to examine the current role, risks, challenges, and opportunities for assurance services and CSR reporting. So my focus really will be assurance and auditing services in CSR, but I first need to understand the area and fill in some blanks because it was a little bit confusing to me. So first, I did a little bit of a literature review to put some concepts together, and this is what I'm going to be presenting. I'm going to end the presentation with a proposal of the model of something that I want to work in the summer. Right. So first, of course, just CSR for those who are not familiar. It's really a multidimensional term, and it captures a wide range of interrelated concepts in business. They have to do with sustainability, environmental issues, corporate censorship, business ethics, stakeholder management, corporate responsibility. So it's really a lot of interrelated concepts together. And although it's been out since the 1960s and 1970s, when it was first initially started to emerge, it was first just motivated by social considerations. Only over the last decade, there has been an increase in empirical research, which provides evidence of the connection between the CSR practices of companies and their financial payoffs. And I'm going to present some of those studies later just to show what they have found. Right. This is a diagram showing the history of the socially responsible investing in the U.S. Just to point out here, by 2009 was really when it started becoming a little bit more common in business and in the markets, as Bloomberg really added that significant sustainability news, ESG data coverage on their website. So it's a very new concept and big of an under-researched area, especially in as it relates to assurance, and that's why I want to go there, besides the fact that I'm really interested in this. Right? Just again, a very brief overview of the CSR and financial returns literature review to see what they have found. And in 2006, there was a study that showed, I guess it was one of the first empirical ones to be published, that showed that there are substantially higher average returns of the firms that have, of the investments that are based on environmentally responsive portfolio. And that was compared to the lower ranked counterparts over that period. They also found that those portfolios had an average return that was higher than the one suggested by its risk, and the average SRI balance fund outperformed the conventional peers. Something similar came a little bit later. Again, there was a different methodology. They used CSR newswire release date, and they collected news. It was more of a data mining kind of technique, and they found similar results. A little bit more mixed results in 2018. So there are still some mixed results connecting CSR and financial returns, but the majority of the studies have a positive relationship between the two. So as a result, there is really a lot more interest in sustainable investment, and a study by the US CFI Foundation found that investing in sustainable assets grew by 12.0 trillion in 2018, which represents a 38% increase over the 2016 numbers that they have collected. So it's a huge increase, a huge interest in this area, and it is, I think, very important to understand how reliable are some of those reports. Right. So again, as a result of this trend, CSR and reporting are on the rise. and this is backed up by numbers. The KPMG survey found that around 3/4 of the 4,900 companies studied in the report are actually issuing CSR reports. So there's a lot of volunteer reporting of that information because firms perceive that it's something that it's looked good, right? So the problem here is that there's that risk of greenwashing. If it looks so good and everybody's doing it, so firms are likely to put out the best picture of themselves that they can. And the solution that has come out of that, or at least that is perceived to be a solution, is that there's the assurance and auditing of the CSR reports. Again, these are non-mandatory, so firms do not really have to provide any type of assurance. They can just put out those CSR reports and publish them without the requirement of auditability like that there is in the financial statement audits. Okay. Nevertheless, the KPMG survey that I referred to earlier, which was published in 2017, found that more than 2/3, about 67% of the G250 companies seek assurance of their CSR data, which is now becoming more of an accepted standard practice. So there is really a need to look into that type of assurance and the auditing, and there's so many questions that can be answered. Before I go to those questions, again, it's important to understand how the CSR is measured and reported before we can really understand how it needs to be audited. So my next step was to look and research that area to see what's going on right now. So again, here are my findings. There are really different ways that CSR is measured in the market. Some of the most commonly used measures are the ESG ratings, the Corporate Responsibility Index, and that green score. So those measures just come out from different type of rating agencies, and they're available for investors in the market to use. On the financial reporting, not financial, I mean the CSR reporting, analogous to financial reporting framework, there is something out there. The most commonly used one is the GRI G4 guidelines that organize the standard disclosures in the 3 categories that are similar to the ESG, which are economic, environmental, and social. So this is how the companies report, most of the companies. Again, there's no requirement as to how to do it exactly. And so that's where the questions arise. So, so who provides now the CSR and auditing services? And how consistent are those assurance reports provided by the different parties? What standards do they apply? And those relate to both the reporting and assurance frameworks. And then out of all that, how does the CSR assurance affect the traditional audit risk model? So those are questions that I'm interested to answer, and I'm going to be continuing my research into what is out there, of course, after this course. But what I have found so far is that really the accounting profession does not have a monopoly in assurance services related to CSR. There are the audit firms must compete with the other types of service providers in providing that kind of assurance. But nevertheless, it was found that about 2/3 of the firms who choose to have their CSR reports audited, they choose a major audit firm. Okay, and now, and the way that they use, there is the IASB standard or assurance on greenhouse gas statement that provides the most commonly publicly available single issue report as to how to do that. Again, the problem is now that there's really not even consistency in what standards are used to provide those assurance reports. There's, interestingly, it looks like the assurance providers who come from the accounting profession use the IASB standard to guide their audits, but again, there's not really too much specific guidance there, whereas the assurance providers that come from outside the profession use an alternative assurance standard. And the question is that how does that affect the consistency of the reports that they provide? So there are really many challenges in the CSR audit. The existence of the alternative providers, the less regulation and relative lack of consistent guidance, the fact that the information is not homogeneous and is not generated from a standardized system, and as it was basically captured well by Colin Simon when they said the lack of analytic rigor that arises in double entry systems, which accountants and auditors are used to have when they look at this information. So the traditional auditing techniques may not be as efficient or effective. And there's also a lot of financial, non-financial terms that are blurred in those reports, which provide some opportunities in this area. So things such as utilization of artificial intelligence and data collection analysis for audit purposes can help, and collection of alternative big data, again, is something that is already used by the rating agencies, but it can be potentially used by the audit firms. I have looked at current literature in the CSR assurance. There's not really much other than looking at understanding the market and also studying who benefits from it, but there's not much research in the individual decision-making level. And my hypothesis really here is that the fact that there's less quantitative, more qualitative measures in combination with the relative lack of consistent guidance, it could lead to more reliance on professional judgment. And I want to look at what influences the auditor judgment, the CSR-related audits. And I'm thinking that due to decreased regulation, there's there might be some lower skepticism and lower audit quality. And there are potential study designs here that could be used. Mine would be more towards an experiment, really designing two groups of auditors that are randomly assigned and using a design similar to this one here, to what extent auditors' attitudes towards the evidence influenced by self-fulfilling prophecy that I presented, to go about that. I know I'm rushing because I know I don't have too much time, but I will need, of course, to develop how this is going to be designed and to look at really how the auditing changes, or how the decisions and evidence is evaluated when the framing is different in those results. And I have my timer here, so I guess I need to stop. But I will be happy to answer questions, or if you want, I can keep going. So in conclusion, there's really, CSR is really important, and the risk of greenwashing as firms try to exploit the booming in CSR. The fact that there are currently multiple providers of assurance and there's really no guidance as to how this assurance should be provided, there's no regulation, gives rise to a lot of different questions and about the quality of that assurance, the value of it. So I want to really see what goes into the judgment and decision making that relate to providing that assurance, and therefore the quality of that assurance. I can't hear. Hello?
Why do you say less regulation?
There's less regulation, not in CSR practices, but there's less regulation in how the audits of the CSR are going to be done. So there's a lot of guidance for conducting financial statement auditing, but there's not really guidance or really many regulations. There's no.
Okay, you mean you're comparing financial with CSR audits?
Yeah, I'm comparing the audits, not the generation so much of the report. There's really not even much guidance in how the firms generate those reports. There's so much guidance and regulation as to using GAAP to prepare the financial statements, and then the auditors have to use specific methods to audit those financial statements. But with CSR, there's really not so much structure, there's not much guidance, so it's a little bit whatever firms want. They have a lot of different choices, and there's not much looking into what goes in there. And I think that's really a risk, especially now that a lot of investors are relying on those reports. So, I mean, I'm interested in two respects, and something that I want to expand later is to look at perceptions of the users of those reports and how they affect their decisions based on what they see. So how much impact do those reports have? And then the other area that I want to look at is the decision making as to how auditors make their decisions when they prepare those reports. Are there differences between the reports prepared by financial auditors versus the other providers? I've looked at some methodology. I have access to, actually my brother does some sort of auditing. He's not an accountant, but of emissions, and he shared his methodology that the firm provides. So I want to compare perhaps the standards of auditing with those and see if there are any differences, and then also see how this information is evaluated.
You're just making an analogy. Just make an analogy here. I always objected to the guidelines they gave for cybersecurity audits. I said they were trying to fit a square keg into a round hole, and the point in time, materiality, etc., wasn't relevant. And I'm afraid that if they try to force traditional financial audit methodology into CSR, they're going to finish up with the same irrelevancy.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem here. That's one of the things that I found. There's really a lot of the firms go to the Big Four, perhaps because of their reputation. So those Big Four really use what they have in their hands, which is some auditing methodology, because there's no other guidance to use. So that might not be necessarily the best thing to use, and then we don't really know how to, how they use it, because they don't really have the same risks of getting their own opinion that they would have in providing their own opinion for the financial statements. So is that auditing really worth anything? Is it what we think it is? So these are some questions that I would like to answer here. It's a big area.
What I suggest in the cybersecurity stuff is some very different principles, reconsidering what materiality was, not making it 0-1, but giving it a rating, and something closer to continuous audit. So those were thoughts that maybe we should explore eventually.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrea. I'm thinking that, like, when we talk about CSR, it's really a broad topic. Like, we have environment, social, governance. I'm thinking that, do you think anyone has gone through the list of the items disclosed in CSR and classify them into quantifiable and those that cannot be quantified? Because I'm thinking for the items that can be quantified, like carbon emission or like wastewater emission, then we can think of methods to measure them, right? But for qualitative aspects, maybe some methodological aspects, we can leave them for now. I'm just thinking about how auditors audit those things. So yeah, maybe this is just a generic comment.
Yeah, no, this is really, for me, it's all really unknown. So that's, and I don't think there is really so much clarity in the literature or anywhere. So that's what I'm trying to really understand for us to collectively put together and have it say, okay, so who provides those reports? How do they do it? What's the consistency between their methods? How do they quantify things that, which things can they quantify? What kind of assurance do they provide at the end? Because we see it there, it's there, but people perceive it, okay, somebody looked at it and they said it's fine. How fine is it really? So I really want to dig further and see how they do it. And I do have some connections in the firm that I worked as well, and I know they provide assurance. I want to see if they can share perhaps some of what they do. I know that there's not always the easiest thing. As I said, I was able to obtain methodology of how non-accountants provide some assurance and what kind of things they could quantify and what methods they use. But I would be definitely very interested to see what they do as well.
I can ask the AICPA if they have some materials they collected for audits in this direction.
Yeah. I mean, there is some information, I think, there as well, but there's limited, and it's really scattered. It takes a lot to put together those concepts.
Hi, Andrea. So can I ask 2 questions?
Yes.
So, my first question is that I don't know if I understand correctly. So basically, what you want to study is to say if we can provide a methodology or structure to provide assurance for the compliance report or activities. So what you want to focus is their CSR report or many other related CSR related activities.
Yeah, so first, I really want to focus as to what influences the assurance provider's judgment when they look at the evidence that relates to CSR. And the problem with CSR is that it's not similar. There are many differences between the financial reports and CSR. So how does that affect their understanding and their decision making? So really, I want to test to see, and I'm thinking that perhaps they don't do such a thorough review, or perhaps the quality of the current assurance might not be as good or consistent as we may think. So I think that there's some factors that might change it. Perhaps the perceived risk of that engagement will change how they look at the evidence. But I want to see first, how they make the decisions about CSR audits.
I see. And my next question is that could you please explain a little more about how you would like to measure the perception of the users of the CSR performance of the firms?
So that's something in the future. It's not. It's because I do want to do that for my dissertation as well. But the only way I can think of is perhaps through some experiments and sharing some case studies or simulations and trying to measure how they perceive the company to be, or perhaps if the reports come from 2 different kinds of providers, they will rate them differently if it's a big audit firm or somebody else, and things like that. But I haven't really gotten into much detail, and I really don't know how to design experiments very well. It's something that I want to learn, but that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, I read some very interesting papers about this, that they use Facebook. For example, they use Facebook, and we know that in the Facebook, people can provide some they like or dislike or feel angry about the post. So I think maybe that is a way that we can measure that what our Facebook users, or it can be representative to some extent of the investors' perception of their performance. So I think that you may, if you are interested, you can have a look at these papers.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. We can perhaps share some ideas and literature that we have found. Thank you.